This idea that like the systems that we built to serve us now, like we're in service of them. I don't know, maybe there's some comfort in the fact that even the most elite billionaires on the planet feel as helpless as I do. Cool.
Yeah. Joshua Belhumeur and Malcolm Critcher are the hosts of the podcast This is Propaganda, which reveals the hidden influence of propaganda all around us and how it continues to profoundly shape our culture today. For this episode, the boys are here to tell me about the hottest new trend in the billionaire bubble, luxury doomsday shelters. Over the last few years, members of the ultra-rich have begun prepping for some apocalyptic future events, and they're doing it with style, while, as usual, being really embarrassing about it. So join us as we enter their futuristic world, try to understand their tech bro mindset, and take a look at the history of apocalyptic prepping to see how unchecked capitalism has transformed the way we think about the end of the world. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am so excited to welcome both Josh and Malcolm from This is Propaganda, a very cool show that I know that all of you listeners out there would love. And we have a super strange conversation today. It only feels like it's getting more relevant every day. So welcome to you both.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We're excited to be here.
Hello.
Before we really dive into the whole luxury doomsday shelter conversation that we're going to have, I'd like to just get to know you both a little bit. As I mentioned, your podcast is called This is Propaganda. That's kind of like one arm of what you both do. But could you tell our audience kind of about what your mission is with your podcast and with This is Propaganda in general?
Yeah, so This is Propaganda is, our goal is to reveal the hidden influence of propaganda all around us and how it impacts culture. And I think when we say hidden influence of propaganda, people's heads immediately tend to go to, dark forces lurking in the shadows. And that's part of the point of what we like to cover and talk about is it's not necessarily the secret stuff. It's the stuff we confront every day, like consumer marketing, advertising. All of that is built on the same building blocks of propaganda. And so, yeah, our goal was, I think, one part media literacy, one part cultural theory, and a little bit of history lesson thrown in there. Really, I think starting with people that work in marketing and advertising was like our first audience. Because we do a lot of work in that space. We're part of a media company called Brink, and part of what we do is brand work, and part of what we do is original productions. And we just kept coming across people who just didn't understand the history of their craft or why they're doing what they're doing, and certainly what the negative impacts could be. So I think the metaphor I always use is, if we were a factory making widgets and spewing pollution out into the environment, we would all see it and we would talk about it. So what is the cultural pollution of making media and propaganda? And so that's our mission. And we explore that through our podcast. We have both a mix of narrative, like scripted series in season 1, which we were proud to win a Webby Award for.
Yeah.
And then we have a conversation series called Doublethink that we're going deep into different conversations, kind of inspired by that first season, exploring and putting more depth to the different issues that we confront.
Oh, that's great. You all cover such similar stuff to what we cover here. So I feel like it's a very kindred space. And I do have to say the Brink website is maybe the coolest website I've ever seen visually. It's like, I love looking at it. It's so cool. So I'm going to encourage everybody to check that out too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, I know we're both fans of your show as well. And I agree, like lots of overlap. I think hysteria and propaganda are one and the same in a lot of respects, right? Because one of the things propaganda inherently does is push you to be uncomfortable with where you're at and wanting to move to a new place, right? And a lot of that tends to be rooted in hysteria.
Yeah, it really it's like propaganda harnesses hysteria a lot. And so, yeah, we're talking about two sides of the same coin here, I think. Okay. So let's get into what we're talking about today. We are talking about the hyper rich, the mega wealthy, especially it seems the tech bros of the billionaire class. And we're talking about how they are, quote unquote, preparing for some kind of end times. What that looks like, depends on who you ask, I suppose. But what we do know is that many of them are building these luxury doomsday bunkers. I bet a lot of our audience has heard like little bits and pieces of this happening because it's, quite a sensationalized thing to report on and to hear about. And so let's first maybe talk about what these doomsday bunkers are like, so we can just start on like a strong visual, because these are, not your Sears brand atomic bomb shelters of the 50s. This is something very different. So would you mind kind of giving us that visual?
Yeah, I can take that. And by the way, this is Josh speaking. So you can associate a name with the voice.
Thank you, Josh.
One of the reviews of our podcast, the critique was me and Malcolm sound too much alike, which I thought that's not a fair critique. Like, what am I supposed to do about that? But
no, you also don't sound alike.
I agree. So,
but yes, please do identify yourselves.
Yeah, I think the entry point for a lot of people into this world, and part of what sparked my curiosity, was Mark Zuckerberg's shelter, because he kind of came out with it last year in the early part of the year, 2024. And he had posted a video from his underground property. And when you dig into it, $270 million is what he spent on building the Kulai Ranch. And so this thing is like a 5,000 square foot underground shelter. His Instagram story was like a movie theater. And he was just like hanging out in his movie theater. And it has all these defense mechanisms. It has its own food supply, its own energy supply. It can weather any sort of event. And so this was like kind of a little bit of a gold standard. But as you start to like look into these shelters, it gets bonkers. There's one called like the Oppidum in the Czech Republic, which is the largest one in the world, 350,000 square feet.
Wow.
Wine cellar, private spa, underground garden. My favorite was also one that had a moat around it with flammable liquids in it, so they could light it on fire anytime they needed to. And then they had water cannons, so they could blast, if helicopters or planes fly around, they could try to blast them out of the sky.
And this, to be clear, is something that has already been built. That wasn't a plan. That moat exists somewhere, or do we not know? Well,
that's the thing, is I'm skeptical. Yes, it supposedly is built, but I think some of this does feel like propaganda in itself.
Yeah, which I know we'll get into.
Yeah. I think part of that is there's definitely like an industry that has come up around this. I think the estimate I was able to find, Blue Weave Consulting said $23 billion is what just luxury underground bunkers are worth today. Mm-hmm. And that's supposed to be on track to $36 billion by 2030. Wow. So yeah, lots of money to be made within this industry. But I think that like it strikes me as odd how much information you can find on places like Forbes and Wired Magazine, which tend to be the playgrounds for tech billionaires to, publicize themselves and their personal brands. So you do have to question both motivations and veracity of some of these claims, but we know some of them exist for sure. Yeah. Especially Mark Zuckerberg's.
Malcolm, do you have any favorite doomsday fucking luxury shelters?
I don't know about any super specific one that I've seen from the ultra elite wealthy. I think I find it endlessly humorous that anyone would want to try and exist in a post-apocalyptic Armageddon situation compared to just trying to simply solve or avoid the Armageddon is something that just the idea of fundamentally extracting and exploiting as much value as possible from someone and then being perpetually terrified of the crackback of it being done to you to the point where you have to insulate yourself is just such a bizarrely like American id thing to do.
Yes.
It feels like something from a David Foster Wallace novel or something. It doesn't feel real. You know, what Josh was saying of, I don't know how much of this is and isn't propaganda. To me, it's like, it only benefits ultra elite people for us to believe that they have a moat that can go up in flames and fire hoses that can shoot helicopters out of the sky, right? Mm-hmm. How much of this is just purely a LARP and complete fantasy, to me, is the thing that I always wonder.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, I know that there's like a really strong apocalyptic sense in general right now. I think a figure that I saw from you both was 4 in 10 people think that we're living in the end times. I wasn't sure if that was like a global figure or an American figure. Do you know that?
Yeah, I think it was global.
Okay.
Actually.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know how much that differs from other times in history, but that is pretty alarming figure. I know that I grew up with a dad who was really into prepping, still is really into prepping, and he was prepping originally for 2012 and the, you know, December 21st, 2012 scenario that, you know, created its own little mini hysteria. And I know that kind of was a starting point, or at least one of the larger jumping off points for the creation of this more luxury doomsday prepping industry. So I know that it may not be necessarily related to 2012 and that whole Mayan apocalypse that was so well publicized, but can you talk about kind of what happened in 2012?
From what I understand, it's Y2K is the big driving force of when the idea of the like prosumer prepper really starts to take hold. And then from there, it's almost just this repeated, like Y2K throughout the 90s really grabs a pop cultural center hold in people's minds, which I would argue has to do with the end of history, right? Where like America has had a infinite frontier and a bad guy to rail against for centuries. Mm-hmm. And the USSR is defeated and there's really nothing left. And almost instantly, the information age happens simultaneously. Our world becomes so complex that you're telling me all of the computers are going to start like crashing planes out of the sky. I never am really even going to understand super what it means. I might like have a thing I quote, but I'm not ever going to mega get it. My understanding is pretty much from that getting fixed in the American zeitgeist, we almost never really get it out of our teeth. Mm-hmm. Like, it's like, it's Y2K, it's 9/11, it's 2012, it's climate change. They may vary in terms of legitimacy of a fear around them, but we never get rid of that idea of like something horrible is going to happen imminently.
Yeah, and then I think the date 2012 is important because just if you start looking through Google search trend research, you find that's the first time anybody mentioned a luxury doomsday shelter. Mm-hmm. So
that's crazy.
It is interesting that there could be a parallel there, or it could just be that, you know, our media ecosystem was changing quite a bit around that era too. And the BuzzFeedification of media was hitting its stride around then, when it's like people were looking for content and headlines. And somebody went looking for something like that and was able to start reporting on it. Mm. And then, you know, it just like slowly started ramping up over time until 2020. And then it hit a massive spike where it just seemed like, I guess, a lot of either wealthy people were sitting around saying society's falling apart. What do I do? Or just everybody was bored and they started being curious about, I wonder if rich people have doomsday shelters and Googling it more.
Yeah. Wasn't there some kind of report that happened in 2012 kind of about maybe not the hyper rich that we're talking about, but maybe a little bit more of an affordable doomsday shelter that was optioned to people?
Yeah. I think the right around this time, there was, instead of like a private standalone luxury doomsday shelter, there was a few communities popping up. And so, yeah, Soledad O'Brien had done a report on a Kansas missile silo. They made a big deal of saying like, we won't tell you exactly where in Kansas, but they had like converted an old missile silo into like 12 apartments that were underground, and these were selling for like $1.5 to $3 million each. And so it does seem like this is the first time we've seen anybody mention this, and it's still kind of within reason, I would say, compared to like what we're talking about with Zuckerberg. And then there's other examples of that are, I think, kind of interesting, like the communities. I liked a commune called Trident Lakes in Texas, which was 700 acres. And the idea of like 600 condominiums, a golf course, polo fields, like it's not even underground. It's like a whole society, but it's built this massive like defense mechanism around it. And it's built underground aspects to it that even include like a DNA vault where they can like store, you know, I guess human information. I don't know what you would use the DNA vault for. Yeah. That's what's confusing about this is it's like, it feels like people that watch science fiction and then they're like, oh, that would be cool. And they don't really think about it too much beyond that.
Yeah, it's like they just want to have a bunch of children in the future, even if they're dead. They gotta keep that DNA line going. If, you know, Elon Musk is any example of that. So let's kind of talk about the company now that is the big number one luxury doomsday bunker company out there, Atlas Survival. I know that they're doing a lot of the work for these, you know, tech billionaires who are the most interested in building these bunkers. But I also know that the Kardashians went bunker shopping. So this is not, this is spreading to different types of celebrities as well. So who is Atlas Survival and how did they come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems like this whole ecosystem of, you know, there's a few players. Atlas is one of them. I think, again, propaganda, they claim to be number one. I don't know if that's true. There's also Rising S is the name of another one. And then there's one based out of Virginia called Safe. But all of them, you know, obviously, as this market has grown, are coming in to fill a need. And you can tell some of them were doing more like traditional bunkers, like Atlas. You mentioned the Kardashians. Yeah, they had a episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians where they went bunker shopping, and they were looking at like these prefabbed ones that range in $200,000 to $400,000 a pop. Okay, I think those are almost like those are the entry point, but the real opportunity is the bespoke, you know, custom built environment. And it seems like what has happened is, you know, they started with creating this market of these prefabbed luxury bunkers, but then it just started to beget more and more customizations over time. And that happened pretty quickly. And I think that's a classic, like Keeping Up with the Joneses, you know, my neighbor down the street did this. Well, can I one up them? And you kind of go back and forth. And now you're seeing like some other players that are in the game might specialize in just like, we make really dope doors that are just like super complex and they can withstand blasts and they have really cool biometrics and stuff. So we'll come in and we'll install these doors, and you'll see like a lot of ultra wealthy like to build complex like escape rooms within their houses down into their underground layers. And it just all seems like an adventure. Yeah. And not necessarily rooted in actual survival. One story that I thought was really funny was this guy, Gary Lynch, who's the principal from Rising S Bunkers, talked about how one of his customers called him and just couldn't figure out how to get into his secret home. He was locked out of his own home. It's like, can you imagine like if we were in a post-apocalyptic scenario, like he thinks he's going to call a customer service line and get in, and just how funny that would be of like him being locked out of his own bunker while like the zombies are bearing down, or whatever he thinks the threat is bearing down on him.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, that's such a perfect encapsulation, I think. More after this. And now back to the show. I think what's interesting too about this is that there is such a large discrepancy between something like a small shelter in which you're waiting out maybe some cataclysmic event that you hope to survive, then you come out and are back in the world again. Whereas this seems to be kind of a situation where there's no expectation of that return or the ability to survive above ground, which is very different than, say, the 1950s, when the idea was protection for this particular moment in time and then the hope to return. Right. So I don't know. I just think that that's a really interesting change, and I think has to do with the mindset of the people who are building these luxury bunkers.
I would almost say that it's a logically positive change. I mean, why fallout shelters ultimately fail totally in the 60s is because they do not answer the problem.
Right.
The problem is the specter of a general nuclear exchange ending humanity. Why does it matter if I survive that?
Yeah.
Like you haven't actually alleviated the anxiety, right? And I think now we live in a world that is so obscenely complicated that the only real answer is no, you can just retreat forever. Whether you're talking about Italian lords building giant castles or fallout shelters or billionaire bunkers, the ultimate core thing is this idea of we are fundamentally unwilling to solve the problem for real.
Yeah.
We're fundamentally unwilling to make a more equitable economic marketplace. We're fundamentally unwilling to consider nuclear de-armament. So the only thing we can consider is a fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it really speaks to American individualism in a huge way, where it's like I can cordon myself off, perhaps a small group of people that I allegedly love, in this smaller and smaller space and smaller community that is totally cut off from the larger world, and even the larger local world, and expect to have that work, without all of the aspects of community that we absolutely need, not only to feel nourished as a human soul, but just in the very basic sense. Like you said, there's not going to be anyone around to fix your bunker door when it won't open. So I think it's just this kind of logical endpoint of this hyper individualist society that we live in.
Yeah, it's also such a microcosm of this idea that like the systems that we built to serve us now, like we're in service of them, where it's like even the most powerful elites in society feel powerless to the machine, right? Where it's like, even if you wanted to put a stop to it, you don't know how. And so you just have to protect yourself. And I think that's something everybody feels, no matter where you are in class. You feel that powerlessness to the complexity. And I don't know, maybe there's some comfort in the fact that even the most elite billionaires on the planet feel as helpless as I do. Cool.
Yeah, it is kind of this like very embarrassing thing that you can have so much. You could have the most power of, potentially anyone in the world, and you're still so afraid that you have to spend a large, or at least not even a large portion, you have to spend what we would all consider an obscene amount of money to insulate yourself from this psychological terror that, you may pretend you don't have on a daily basis, but it's lurking down there, obviously, in all of these billionaires and men, and we see it every day.
Yeah, this is the same thing as building a rocket. It's scratching the same itch of everybody wanting to colonize Mars, and it's just all about escaping reality. There's also a big movement around, uploading consciousness onto computers. And to me, it's all the same thing of all these billionaires are just afraid of their mortality too. It always strikes me how often that comes up, like it's the Peter Thiel getting blood transfusions from young people and stuff like that. It's like, why are you so motivated and so afraid of this thing, And I don't know, maybe part of that is the idea of our mortality is the thing that makes us not special. It makes us all the same.
Yeah.
And that is like the ultimate frontier. Like if you can battle that and you can exist outside of death's door, so the march towards the grave, then you have real power,
Right.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's just like if you are a Randian individualist, death is it's the ultimate. You can't, no amount of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps will allow you to escape the fact that you will inevitably die. And so it's the final boss of Atlas Shrugged.
Ooh, the final boss. I also I've never really understood why people want to live forever, but that's a whole other conversation. It's very, very strange. What it really also brings up for me is this sense like you mentioned, rockets, uploading your consciousness, the rapture, right? It's like we want to be lifted away from this world. And it's just strange how that desire continues to manifest like through the centuries, which I think is intrinsically married to kind of the luxury doomsday culture, is the like tech utopianism or whatever, like the eventual ability to transcend the world and live in this kind of heaven, whether that be the heaven of the Bible or the heaven of, oh, I can be in my little pod and get, you know, all these pleasure points for all eternity. It feels like the same thing. We want to escape our humanity in some way.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think that part of what the struggle here is, or the challenge is that so many of these things, I mean, I don't know how much anybody genuinely believes like we're going to colonize Mars or we're going to be able to upload our consciousness. It almost feels like the action, like the symbolic actions of having it or doing it or investing in it is good enough to kind of like placate. But I could be wrong. There could be true believers out there. It just seems like a lot of it is purely like a performance for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And performance, I think, is also very much tied in with propaganda. And why propaganda works is if I am a luxury doomsday shelter salesman and I'm able to sell the vision of peace of mind that comes with having your doomsday shelter, you don't necessarily want to interrogate it deeper. Mm-hmm. You like the feeling that it connotes, so you might as well go along with it. And I think there was like a sentiment in one of these interviews around the shelters where it was just like, isn't this not going to work? And it's like, well, it's better than doing nothing, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, I guess that's motivating a lot of our decision making these days.
Yeah, I think you're right. So maybe we can get into that mindset a little bit. We did talk about Y2K as a jumping off point for the modern prepper movement. So is there anything about that movement that feels like it's informing what's happening today with these luxury bunkers?
Well, I like what Malcolm was digging into with how like the government propaganda around us needing to be like prepared for like nuclear attacks and all that, how they needed to like sort of outsource that into the private sector. And that might have planted seeds that still continue to this day.
Yeah, I mean, that's where all of the modern, how we think about the idea of any kind of shelter all kind of starts in the wake of World War II, because that is when the reality of genuine planetary Armageddon actually gets put on the shoulders of the human species. Prior to then, you know, a shelter could be just like a panic room or like a locked closet, because you just kind of had to wait out something real. There was no the world is going to be irradiated for hundreds of years lock-in situation. So pretty much like post World War II, you know, we all know it, we love it. America drops not one but two nukes. And immediately Russia figures out how to make them also, and we freak out. The 50s is this pretty prolonged period where the government is extremely stressed about a general nuclear exchange, and they're trying to figure out what to do about it. And they create the OCDM, which is the Office of Civil Defense and Mobilization. And when they create that, the OCDM quotes them an insane figure of what it's going to take to get American infrastructure to the point where general nuclear exchange would not kill most Americans. Adjusted for inflation, it was, you know, billions and billions and billions of dollars. And Congress said, no, we're not interested in doing that. And so throughout the back half of the 50s, this really concerted propaganda effort starts rolling out from the federal government, incentivizing Americans to build fallout shelters themselves. It takes the pre-existing belief of wanting to be seen as a patriot and as a man who's going to take care of your family, and associates that very deeply with building a fallout shelter in the hopes that the American people will just take this cost on themselves. They also start increasingly collaborating with private industries, deregulating and providing specs of like, this is what a fallout shelter needs to be to survive a nuclear exchange, but increasingly deregulating and incentivizing the ability for them to operate and build fallout shelters. It's all super, super targeted at the suburban parts of America, which is probably why like the Fallout salesman as an image is one of my favorite things from this time period, because to me it combines these two things that like totally epitomize post-World War II America, which is this like quasi-rabid existential fear of your way of life being shifted or thrown into flux in really dramatic ways. And then also this like weird keeping up with the Joneses. I'm trying to dissociate post-World War II. Please let me have my nice house situation that is very fun to me. But yeah, I think ultimately what the most interesting thing here is this turning point. You know, we study propaganda, and the more you dig into it, there's kind of this turning point where the fallout shelters go from being sold by the American government through, you know, your classic like duck and cover stuff, pamphlets, reels that would play before movies where Walt's showing his family how he built his fallout shelter, through to actually being advertised by the private industry. The private industry that the federal government sponsors and creates ends up kind of reeling out of control in the early 60s. And the propaganda is selling the same thing, but it's a unique historic instance from the stuff I've seen where the government goes from selling something to private enterprise selling something. And something that happens as a result that I think is really interesting is when the government's selling it, it's very stalwart. It's very calm. It's very, if we get these shelters, you're going to be the man that your community needs you to be. It's all going to be okay. And it's your civic duty. It's how you're going to fight communism. The second this windfall happens in the early 60s, it's spurred by a JFK speech, and all of the propaganda switches to private industry, it gets really loud and really fear-mongery and like causes a hysteric, like yelling fire in a crowded movie theater situation where there's like this insane rush. Tons of people enter the space who should not be making fallout shelters at all. My favorite one is in Vegas, a swimming pool company just rebrands itself as Foxhole Shelter Company and just starts flipping pools upside down and just selling them as bomb shelters.
Oh my God. Okay.
But that specific like deeper idea I thought was really interesting here is the idea that once the private sector starts being the one propagandizing, the incentives profit, right? When you're the government, the incentive's calm. You got to keep people chill. They can't start rioting. But once it's profit, it's like we can get as loud as we want. And there's some very wild. My favorite one is this excerpt I grabbed, which is in September of 1961, families visiting Prince George Mall in Washington, D.C. were greeted to a recording of air raid sirens and exploding bombs and a looped recording of an anguished male voice that shouted, "My wife, my children, if I'd only listened to civil defense, I'd be in that shelter now."
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, there's this very cool like ADBC of how they're sold and positioned. And in that, something else happens that's kind of neat. So like overnight, hundreds and hundreds of these fly-by-night fallout shelter salesmen kind of enter the markets. As the 60s turn over, the Cold War is really getting hot and people are really, really pressed. And throughout the back half of the 50s, the American man was told that a fallout shelter was your way to combat communism as a civilian. It was your civic duty. It was what a real man looked like who was preparing his family. Suddenly, all of the people who are selling fallout shelters are kind of snake oil salesmen. They start to get a lot of negative press. And suddenly you're like kind of the anxious cuckold who bought an upside down pool. Like the belief that's associated with having a shelter kind of inverts on itself. And overnight, the demand for these collapses. Like 600 firms close in 6 months in the wake of this. And the JFK administration realizes it's super unpopular and starts like aggressively funding community shelters. The FTC cracks down on these people. But I just think it's such a strong lesson in propaganda where public opinion goes from you kind of being like the alpha male of the suburbs to being this like effete kind of anxious, like I'm so scared of what might happen. I got talked into spending 10 grand on a bomb shelter, and how it turns overnight. And then ultimately, I mean, you know, it was the same point I was making earlier of like, the reason that this kind of fizzles until Y2K, in my opinion, is because we're humans. We can only be, you tell me, look, nuclear war is inevitable. And I go, okay, well, can it like not be inevitable? And you say, no, that's not on the menu. I'm sorry. It's inevitable. We're not going to get rid of nukes. They're in the mix. It's like, how long can I really be fucking anxious about it?
Yeah. Like,
we're anxious about it for a while. There's like 20 years of American history where everyone's jacked on nuclear war, but eventually you're just going to be like, since I've been alive, you've been telling me this. Like, I can only hold it in my head as an anxiety for so long. And I do think that's what happens. Like, we never solve this problem, right? Instead, you see like the Fallout shelter, the Fallout salesman kind of becomes this image of like Dr. Strangelove era satire of our leaders, where it's like, in the face of total nuclear Armageddon, all they can do is sell me a fucking box that I have to pay for. Like, that's the best they can do. And then it really doesn't come around again until Y2K. And my theory on that would be that it's because like the end of history happened. Like, the USSR falls, we get globalized markets driven by computers, and there's no one left for America to conquer. Like, that's it. We did it. You know, from Columbus to the USSR dissolving, we have slowly had enemies that we've been terrified of ideologically. We've conquered the frontier. And that's when we start hitting this like Russian roulette of just what's the weird fear that we're going to obsess over.
Yeah. And I guess the internet helped us kind of turn those fears over at a higher and faster rate. We don't have to be told what to be afraid of. We have many, many options, really diversified our hysteria.
You can really pick and choose what your conspiracies are. But then also just the classic, dude, of like, the world just becomes so insanely complex, right? Yeah. Where it's like, it's less scary to me to think that Zuckerberg has water cannons that can shoot helicopters out of the sky. At least someone knows what the hell is going on. Like, if Zuckerberg, if the people who literally are at the 0.00001% also aren't secretly pulling the strings, that's kind of scarier, because it means no one knows how these systems work. Right. And that's much more spooky to me personally, and is repeatedly, as someone who's kind of conspiratorial, the This Is Propaganda project keeps just being me getting all the way down to like what the hell the Dulles brothers were doing at the CIA. And it's like, oh, it's just a bunch of fucking frat boy idiots. Yep. So like, don't know, like our dumbasses, they don't know anything. It's always shocking that it's never that brilliant. It's never anyone that smart. Maybe they get lucky and do something a little conspiratorial, but like most of the time they, you know.
I mean, it really makes me think of like just the dudes at Bohemian Grove, like cosplaying this folk magic type of play they do. And it's like just so embarrassing. And it does, it just makes me think what you're saying about the Illuminati conspiracy of these secret elites pulling the strings, and how that is comforting. And we've talked about this on the show before, certainly. And a lot of people have, where that is comforting to people, because otherwise we have to really reckon with the fact that, there is very little rhyme or reason to reality anymore, or maybe there never was any rhyme or reason. But I guess it is comforting in a way. But then I also feel like maybe this would be a good time to talk about that meeting that Douglas Rushkoff, who wrote this book, Survival of the Richest, Escape Fantasies of the Tech Billionaires. He's a media theorist, and he wrote this book. And it seems like it was kind of misunderstood by these folks who ended up kind of calling him out to the desert to speak with them. Would you want to tell that story? Because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah. And I think Douglas has helped make luxury doomsday shelters more part of the conversation too, at least within some circles. And I'm a big fan of him, and that was probably my first exposure to this. He's actually been recounting this story for a while now, like pre-2018, that he got invited out to, Mojave Desert, I assume like Joshua Tree or something, for like a secret summit of like elites. And he had spent all this time like preparing slides. He thought he was going to give a talk, as he's often asked to do. And he usually has different themes he's hitting on over time. But he, a black car picks him up, takes him way out into the desert, into some like luxury resort. And he ends up in a conference room with just like 4 people walking in the room. So he's prepared to give a talk to like hundreds of people. And it's just like It was five men in a room. And they just start peppering him with questions. And ultimately, he realizes that they're there to ask him questions about what to do after the quote unquote, the event happens, some sort of apocalyptic event, and how they can weather that. And so certain questions include like Alaska or New Zealand. Where should I put my shelter?
Yeah.
The one that was most interesting to me was, how do I pay my security when, currency has no value anymore, right? How do I get them to stay loyal and not just steal all my shit and kill me? And he's just like, best thing I can tell you is you better be nice to them today, because that's like all you got. One of them was talking about his underground pool, and he's like, my neighbor has a indoor pool, and that filter breaks like every 3 weeks. And he's constantly having work done on it. What are you going to do in that case? And the guy was just like, gave him a look and then started scribbling in his journal as if this was an epiphany. So that actually inspired, the book came after that event. That inspired Douglas to write this book, because I think he also saw this as a really good microcosm of how stupid this era in time is, specifically that point about how powerless even the most powerful people feel, and why they're not spending their time imagining a better future, but rather how to protect against the inevitable collapse.
Yeah. I wonder too, I think about this idea of like accelerating the end times, or whatever you would want to call it, in this non-Christian, more secular context. And this gets into, conspiratorial, I guess, content. But do you think that it's possible that there is a sense or even a desire to induce some sort of big cataclysmic event, whether it be climate related or, global poverty or anything like that, in order to bring about this new like tech utopia that they imagine? Or am I going too far to the shadows here?
For a long time, to take this back like 2 beats in this conversation, stuff like the Bohemian Grove genuinely really puzzled me. Like things that are like proven to exist that are so odd and quasi occults, where it's like, okay, I don't think I'm schizophrenic yet. This is happening. So like, what's the deal? And I remember a couple of years ago having the realization that any restaurant I've ever worked at, or any bookstore I've ever worked at, there's at least one weird ass dude who's like really into the occult. And if that guy had infinite money, he would be up to some absolute tomfoolery.
Sure.
And it was kind of, I guess, the realization for me of like, oh, okay, so what's happening is just that like the same percentage of the hyper elite are also just into insane bullshit as like the average Domino's pizza staff. Like the same amount of them are just on some wild nonsense. Inequality has just gotten so insanely severe that those people are able to dedicate hundreds of millions of dollars to doing something truly insane, whether that's like sigil magic or building the sickest fort ever, or trying to bring about like a great reset via, climate change to make a tech paradise. To me, it's like, as long as we continue to let people have an amount of money that allows them to kind of just like break the matrix however they want, you're going to keep seeing weird stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think part of the tech escapism, Douglas talks a lot about that in that book that we mentioned, his take on it, because the paradigm we've created for ourselves with capitalism requires infinite growth. We keep coming up against this issue where it's like, if you're building physical widgets and you're existing in a physical space, you can only grow so much. So we kept abstracting, and first financial markets were the way we abstracted, and we went meta with it, where it's like, okay, I can take land and make it into property and then make a mortgage and then do credit default swaps. And then before you know it, I've tanked the global economy with these like derivatives of derivatives of derivatives. But like tech was the ultimate. Like if we can just move into this space where, the abstraction of, I think as he puts it in the book, if I'm remembering correctly, like the word cat and the image of a cat can be multiplied so many more times than an actual cat can be multiplied. That's a big like motivating factor, in that like we're just stuck in this paradigm of infinite growth. And I think, the tech bros that want to upload their consciousness and potentially accelerate the decline of the physical world to go into the digital realm. Might be just like the brainwashing of that paradigm is like they can't imagine any other way to infinitely grow.
Right. No, that makes sense. More after this. And now back to the show. You know, Malcolm talked about the kind of change from the 50s to the 60s, where it was like we took this need for a bomb shelter or for, you know, a personal nuclear fallout shelter in our backyard really seriously. Then it was privatized, and then it became a little more hysterical. And then eventually it flipped on its ass and became this embarrassing thing. And I wonder if we will get there with these shelters. I think some of us are already there, you know, seeing how this is really an expression of a deep psychological terror about the fact of their own mortality. But I just wonder if we will get to a place, or if we already are at a place, where what happened in the 60s, as you said, in a period of like 6 months will happen, and these luxury shelters will kind of stop proliferating, and we will really change our minds about what they mean on a bigger scale.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. I would say there's a lot of things that we hear billionaires doing that we all think is goofy. It's a different world and a different set of rules. And I do think part of that, you know, not only to Malcolm's point that like, yeah, that dude from the bookstore, if you gave him a lot of money, he might do crazy stuff. But also, if you are so insulated from the pain of everyday life and you don't have to worry about anything, you're naturally going to start to go into goofier places. It's like the unlocked next rung of the pyramid of self-actualization of like, now we got to reach for something else. And so, yeah, I think that we'll probably continue to see that, as we've seen with like, you know, weird blood transfusions and all these other things we hear about that, you know, billionaires do. And I think some of that, you know, is hysteria in our own right. You know, some people are convinced that every single elite on the planet is connected into some sort of satanic cabal or child pedophilia or whatever it is. And I'm not saying that Epstein's not a real thing, but of course, not everybody's connected to it. That's for sure. Or maybe they are. We can go down.
We don't really know. We don't know.
Fast forward 10 years, it's going to be like, look, I know that everyone who ran the Fortune 500 company, but it's not like it's every single one of them. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, to answer your question, I've seen a lot of really crazy stuff around increasingly like Peter Thiel adjacent people looking into South America and aggressively trying to figure out how to create like closed off circuit countries. Like there's places where they can completely peace and just bounce, which I'm surprised hasn't happened yet. I was reading this like wild manifesto that got released recently that was very, very geared around the idea that that's kind of the end game of like technocratic futurists, is this idea of completely decentralized areas where they can just go have basically, you know, a libertarian paradise, which I don't know, surprised isn't already happening, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I can't help but think about is this really interesting change of obviously the secularizing of our culture. But if we go back to like the mid 1800s, like if we go back to kind of before the Industrial Revolution touched all of us, we have William Miller, who is essentially saying that the second coming of Christ is imminent, and, you know, this kind of rapture is coming and everyone will be lifted into the sky, you know, the true believers. And I just find that really interesting because they were all encouraged to get rid of all of their belongings, right? But then once we get into our, you know, hyper-capitalist future, the opposite becomes true, where it's like you need to hoard as much as you possibly can in order to survive this, you know, whatever the collapse may be. But I just think that's just such an interesting change that I think speaks to a larger psychological change in the American mindset.
Yeah, I think it also speaks to, you know, different things have symbolic quality and symbolic meaning in our lives. And we go into this in This Is Propaganda and talking about like a brand, for example. doesn't mean anything, but it also means a lot because we give it meaning. And I do think that, like, yes, that shift that happens, to me, the lesson there is there's this innate need for us to give meaning to the world. We're incapable of just being present and just being animals out in nature. And we have to attribute meaning to everything. And we are just replacing religious symbolism with consumer symbolism, but it's accomplishing the same goal for us. Mm-hmm. And maybe the fact that there's a common narrative of escapism within that is maybe an indicator to us of, like, it's the byproduct of the fact that we think too hard, that we have prefrontal cortexes, and we do have to ascribe meaning to everything. And that's why, like, you know, the ultimate enlightenment is to just be present and not be attributing meaning to things. But it's so hard.
It's so hard. I've been really working on my my mindfulness and presence, and boy, there are a lot of barriers to that inside my brain.
Yeah, you're right. You're literally the worst time in the human history of our entire species alive to try and be like, I'm working on my mindfulness right now.
Yeah.
I feel like we've got the toughest possible loadout.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. Yeah. I think a good thing to kind of focus on toward the end here is the fact that these luxury doomsday bunkers that are being built are essentially being made to insulate the hyper rich from the problems that they have had a large hand in creating, right? Whether that be wealth inequality or climate change. You know, what they're doing is trying to recede away from the problems, like, you know, just like throwing a match in a dumpster and walking away. And I think that is a really important part of this conversation, is about when people create problems and the solutions they make are these hyper individualist kind of libertarian solutions, rather than having any interest in working on those problems that have created the need for these ridiculous displays of being able to escape death, essentially. So would you guys be willing to talk about that? Because I know that was a big part of what you guys were thinking about when you were putting this together.
Yeah, well, I think that, like, we're all guilty of doing that too. It's not like exclusive to billionaires, right? We're always looking at, like, whoever's above us, we complain about what they're doing, and then we never, like, look behind us. And certainly, you know, anybody who's listening to this is probably in the top 5% or 1% globally of just people who are exploiting other people and exploiting the earth's resources.
Yep.
And so I do think it all centers back to, like, that is the unifier, is that we are powerless within the system. And something I've been trying to think a lot about to become more solutions minded rather than just constantly, like, reveling in the problem is the reason why these billionaires are probably feeling so powerless and disconnected from the problems is because they don't confront the problems. They're so sheltered and kept away from them.
Right. In
the same way we are from the problems that we create. Like, when I click buy on Amazon and I don't see, this is Malcolm's joke, he makes the Rube Goldberg machine of suffering that happens when I press that button. Mm-hmm. And so if we wanted to take a lesson away from this, it's, you know, force yourself to mix and mingle with people you don't know, that have different points of view, that come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. That is the solution. And I think, like, the more we can do that and be, like, more engaged in just, like, being humans together from the bottom up, the problems will actually then be able to solve themselves. So that's where my head's been at recently when it comes to propaganda. I think, like, to be honest, I kept thinking, what is the counter propaganda? What is the propaganda that solves our problems? Yeah. And I'm starting to come to the solution. It's like, it's to not engage in the propaganda. Right. And instead, again, like, be present and be connected with one another. So I don't know, maybe a billionaire is listening to this and I'd say, hey, you can come stay in my bedroom in South Philly. I'll take you to a dive bar down the street. You can talk to some Eagles fans. And then maybe you'll be inspired to want to do something different. But until you stop insulating yourself, it's going to be hard to have perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think for people who really want to do the annoying and dirty work of thinking this hard about stuff, there's a very cool ethics essay that I would recommend called Famine, Affluence, and Morality by Peter Singer that pretty much just is about this baseline question of, sure, sucks that the billionaires are doing this. Americans are fundamentally doing the same thing at all times. Yeah. And if you are an American right now, you are kind of engaging in like a little bit of an active dissociative psychopathy of just what's going on. That's not me being like, again, to Josh's point, I'm not trying to be like black pill problems oriented. That's just, let's call this the situation. Then we can start figuring it out. Right. I think that I'm always a big fan of the whole, somewhere on earth, there's some dude under a waterfall who has no idea how scared and outraged he should be. It's completely on you to decide how crippled you feel by this information. And I think that fundamentally associating more of a focus on just what like your community and what is around you is a very, very good start for billionaires and also real people. I think either way, it's a better use of time.
Well, and I guess even if it doesn't ultimately solve the problem, it's a much better way to live your life as a human being. It's a much better way to experience what it means to be alive. I would never want to be a ghost haunting my own fucking creepy underground bunker. Just doesn't sound good to me. I'd much rather hang out, like you said, at the bar with some strangers. And that, in a way, feels much more heavenly to me than whatever the fuck these guys are doing. So I think that's a great, regardless of whether it will bring about our own utopia that we dream of that's quite different. It's not a bad use of our time. And it really is, I think, the only way to change anything is just being a human with other humans.
Yeah. I mean, if I went outside right now and helped the person who's like on the street and not okay within 10 blocks of me, I can go do that. The billionaire can go outside of his house and go find the millionaire who's having not a great day and help him out. If every single person did that, the world would be like, I know this is a, we're 17 having a conversation at that fucking table in every parent's backyard at 4 a.m. type take. But like,
let your hippie out. Yeah.
Yeah. If every person did that, then the big existential problems that make you lay in bed and be like, I don't even want to look at the news, most of them would be solved. So just do your part. Like, all you can control is like, did you go do something today to help out people around you? Great. Everyone do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to end our conversation today. This has been so enlightening, and I think you're both just so interesting to listen to. I could listen to you all day. So really appreciate you coming on, and I'm going to encourage everyone to check out your podcast, This is Propaganda, and your website, Brink, and just get to know you guys over on your show as well. So thanks again, and we'll definitely have you back.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
This was American Hysteria. Make sure you subscribe to This is Propaganda wherever you get your podcasts, and head to brink.com to learn more about the work of Josh and Malcolm. If you want to support our show and get ad-free episodes and bonus content, head to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get access to the other podcasts that I do with our producer Miranda called Hysteria Home Companion, where we give you a behind-the-scenes look at how the show is made and tell you stories related to the topics we're covering and stories we just know that you'll love. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. If you go to AmericanHysteria.com, you can pick up some of our merch, and you can leave us a message on the Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up or even one you've heard recently, and we might do an entire investigation about it. It's AmericanHysteria.com. You can follow us on Instagram at American Hysteria Podcast. And if you're feeling generous, leave us a review on the app of your choosing. It really helps us out. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius Smith. And I'm your host, Chelsey Weber Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening. And I hope you have a great